Dean Martin's hand froze mid-air, the photograph slipping from his fingers onto the hospital blanket, because Sammy Davis Jr. had just said something Dean never expected to hear again, the answer to a question he'd asked 27 years ago at 3 in the morning when he thought no one remembered. Wait, because what happened in the next 8 minutes wasn't just a deathbed conversation, it was the paying off of a secret that had shaped both their careers, and the final joke that made Dean Martin cry and laugh at the same time for the first time since his son died. The photograph landed face up on the white hospital blanket. 5 men in tuxedos, arms draped over each other's shoulders, frozen in 1960 at the Copa Room in Las Vegas, when everything seemed conquerable and death was something that happened to other people. Dean's eyes were still locked on Sammy's face, trying to process what he'd just heard, while somewhere in the hallway, a medicine cart rattled past, and the fluorescent lights hummed their steady electric drone. "You remember?" Dean's voice came out hoarse, barely louder than the ventilator's mechanical whisper in the corner of the room. Sammy's eyes were brighter than they'd been in weeks, despite the IV line snaking into his arm and the oxygen tube beneath his nose. His smile was weak but unmistakable, and when he spoke, each word cost him something. "Every word, Dino. You asked me if I ever regretted saying yes when Frank called. You asked me if the price was too high." Dean sank back into the vinyl chair beside the bed, the photograph forgotten between them. His hands were shaking now, and he pressed them flat against his thighs to make them stop. The room smelled like disinfectant and dying flowers, but all Dean could think about was that night in 1963, the night he'd driven to Sammy's house in the middle of a rainstorm with a half-empty bottle of scotch and a question he'd never asked anyone else. "Look, here's what you need to understand about that phone call. It came 3 months after President Kennedy was shot, when the world felt like it was coming apart at the seams, and the Rat Pack's association with Camelot had turned from golden to poisonous overnight. Dean had been sitting in his living room at 2:45 in the morning, staring at the phone, wondering if any of it had been worth it. The fame, the Vegas lights, the cameras, the politics that pulled at them like undertow. He'd picked up the phone and dialed Sammy's number without thinking, and Sammy had answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting. "I need to talk to someone who gets it," Dean had said, and Sammy had simply replied, "I'll leave the gate open." Sammy's house in the Hollywood Hills had been dark except for one light burning in the den. Dean had let himself in, tracking rainwater across the white carpet, and found Sammy sitting in an armchair with a glass of milk and a sleeping pill he hadn't taken yet. They'd sat there until dawn, broke over the city, talking about everything and nothing, and somewhere around 5 in the morning, Dean had asked the question that had been eating at him since the day Frank Sinatra had first called him to join something that would become legendary. "Do you ever regret it, Sam? Saying yes to all of this? Because I look at what you've had to go through, the doors they still won't let you through, the things they say about you in the press, and I wonder if we did you any favors. I wonder if the Rat Pack was good for you, or if we just made you a target." Sammy had looked at him for a long time, and then he'd smiled that smile that could light up a stadium. "Ask me again someday when I'm too old to lie, Dino. Ask me when I'm dying, and I'll tell you the truth." Dean had laughed it off, drunk enough to let it slide, and they'd never spoken about that night again. Not in all the years that followed, not through the touring and the television specials and the slow dissolution of the group. Not even when Dean Paul died and Sammy had flown across the country to stand beside Dean at the funeral, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. But now, 27 years later, in a hospital room that smelled like the end of everything, Sammy was finally answering. "I'm dying, Dino, so I can't lie anymore," Sammy said, and he had to pause to catch his breath, each word coming slower now. "And the truth is this. Every door they slammed in my face, every name they called me, every hotel that made me sleep somewhere else while you guys got sweets, all of it was worth it because of that one thing you did without even knowing you did it." Dean leaned forward, his throat tight. "What did I do, Sam? You treated me like I was already equal before the world caught up." Sammy's voice was fading now, soft as tissue paper. "Every time we walked on stage together, you stood next to me like it was the most natural thing in the world. You didn't make a speech about it. You didn't make it a statement, you just did it. And every person who saw us saw that, Dino. They saw you, Dean Martin, standing shoulder to shoulder with Sammy Davis Jr. like it was nothing special, and that's how they learned it was supposed to be." Notice something about that answer. Sammy didn't say the fame was worth it. He didn't say the money or the applause or the movie deals made the pain worthwhile. He said Dean made it worthwhile, just by standing next to him like it wasn't a radical act, when in 1960 in Las Vegas, it absolutely was. Dean's vision blurred and he realized he was crying without making a sound. He'd spent 60 years perfecting the art of keeping his feelings locked up, of playing it cool no matter what. And here in this hospital room with the machines beeping and the afternoon light slanting through the blinds, all of that careful control was dissolving. "You never told me," Dean managed to say. "I couldn't. If I'd told you, you might have thought about it. You might have started wondering if you were doing it right or if people were watching. And then it wouldn't have been natural anymore. It had to be unconscious, Dino. It had to be just who you were." The photograph was still lying between them, those 5 young men captured in a moment when time seemed infinite. Dean picked it up with trembling fingers and looked at it properly for the first time in years. There was Frank in the center, confident and electric, Joey Bishop on the left, always the quiet one, Peter Lawford on the right before the falling out, Dean himself looking bored in that practiced way he had. And Sammy, smaller than all of them but somehow taking up just as much space, his face bright with joy. But look closer at Sammy's expression in that photograph, because Dean was seeing it for the first time now. Sammy wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking slightly to his left, at Dean's face. And there was something in that look, something Dean had missed for 30 years. It was gratitude and love and brotherhood all mixed together, frozen in silver halide and time. "You were looking at me," Dean said quietly, turning the photo so Sammy could see it. "Always, partner. You were my North Star up there. When things got tough, when I felt the weight of being the only one like me in the room, I'd catch your eye and you'd give me that look, that 'we got this' look, and I knew I could keep going." Dean turned the photograph over, remembering what he'd written on the back before coming here. His handwriting, shaky now with age, read, "For Smokey, the best there ever was. Love, Dino." But there was something else there now, something written in pencil in Sammy's unmistakable hand, words that must have been added recently, maybe in the last few days, when he knew Dean might finally come. "You answered on the back," Dean whispered, reading the words. "You wrote back to me." Sammy nodded, the effort exhausting him. "Read it out loud, Dino. I want to hear it in your voice." Dean's hands were shaking so badly, he almost dropped the photograph again, but he steadied himself and read the words Sammy had written beneath his own message. "To Dino, who asked me a question in the rain and gave me 27 years to find the answer. Yes, it was worth it, every second of it. Thanks for standing next to me. Your friend always, Smokey." The room went quiet except for the machines and the sound of 2 old men trying not to fall completely apart. The nurse had said Sammy had maybe 12 hours of clarity left before the morphine and the cancer pulled him under for good, and 4 of those hours were already gone, burned up in memories and confessions and the slow unraveling of decades-old secrets. Stop for a second and picture these 2 men. Dean Martin, 63 years old, his famous dark hair gray now, the swagger replaced by something gentler and more broken. Sammy Davis Jr., 64 and weighing maybe 90 pounds, his legendary energy reduced to shallow breaths and careful words. They'd conquered the entertainment world together, redefined cool for a generation, And now they were down to this: a hospital room, a photograph, 8 minutes that had to contain everything that mattered. "There's something else," Sammy said, and despite everything there was mischief in his voice now, a ghost of the showman who'd commanded stages from Broadway to the Sands. "Something I never told you about that night in 1963. Dean wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "What's that, Sam?" "You showed up at my house at 3 in the morning, drunk and sad and asking existential questions about whether we'd made a mistake." Sammy paused for breath, but his eyes were twinkling now. "You remember what you did before you left at dawn?" Dean searched his memory, but that night was a blur of scotch and rain and raw conversation. "I don't remember leaving. I must have just gone home." "You wrote me a check, Dino." Sammy was smiling wider now, even though it clearly hurt. "You pulled out your checkbook, wrote me a check for $5,000, and you said, 'This is for listening to me be pathetic. Buy yourself something nice.' Then you stumbled out to your car and drove away." Dean's face went red. "I did not." "You absolutely did. I still have it. Never cashed it. Kept it in my wallet for 27 years as a reminder that even Dean Martin, Mr. Cool himself, was human enough to pay someone to be his therapist at 3 in the morning. Despite himself, despite the grief pressing down on his chest like a weight, Dean started to laugh. It came out broken at first, mixed with tears, but then it built into something real, something that filled the room and pushed back against the smell of disinfectant and sorrow. Sammy was laughing too, or trying to, the sound more like a wheeze but unmistakably joyful. $5,000, Dean repeated, shaking his head. "I must have really been in bad shape. The worst I ever saw you. But you know what, Dino? That check was the best tip I ever got. Not because of the money, but because it meant you trusted me enough to fall apart in front of me. You, the guy who never let anyone see behind the curtain. That meant something." They sat there laughing and crying together, the sound drawing a nurse to peek through the door to make sure everything was all right. She saw 2 old men holding each other's hands across a hospital bed, their faces wet with tears and bright with laughter, and she quietly closed the door again, leaving them to their moment. Remember earlier when Sammy said he'd tell the truth when he was dying? This was it. Not just the answer to Dean's question, but the full truth of their friendship. The money and the jokes and the midnight phone calls and the unspoken understanding that had held them together through everything. It was all coming out now, in this room, in these final hours, because there was no more time to hold anything back. "Hey, Dino," Sammy said when the laughter finally faded, his voice so quiet now that Dean had to lean in close to hear. "There's one more thing, about that check you wrote me." "Yeah?" "You dated it wrong. You wrote 1962 instead of 1963. So technically, even if I wanted to cash it, the bank would have rejected it. You were drunker than I thought." Dean burst out laughing again, the sound half sob, half genuine amusement. "Of course I did. I couldn't even write a check right. That's why I kept it. It was perfectly you, generous and thoughtful and just a little bit wrong." Sammy's breathing was getting shallower now, each word requiring more effort. "But Dino, listen to me. When you leave here today, I need you to do something for me. Anything, Sam, you know that. Stop beating yourself up about Dean Paul. Stop thinking you could have saved him, or that you should have been there, or any of that. Your son knew you loved him. He knew it the same way I know it. Not because you said it all the time, but because of who you were when you were next to him. He saw it. I promise you he saw it." Dean's composure shattered completely. He bent forward, his forehead resting on the edge of Sammy's bed, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd held back for 3 years since his son's plane had crashed into the mountain. Sammy's hand, thin and weak, came to rest on top of Dean's head, the gesture as gentle as a benediction. "Thank you," Dean whispered into the blanket. "Thank you for saying that." They stayed like that for a long time, 2 old friends who'd shared everything except this final truth, until Dean finally lifted his head and wiped his face with his sleeve. The light in the room had changed, afternoon fading toward evening, and Sammy's eyes were heavy now, the exhaustion catching up with him. "I should let you rest," Dean said, but he didn't stand up. He couldn't, not yet. "One more thing," Sammy said, his voice barely a whisper now. "That story I told you about the check, that wasn't the real secret." Dean frowned. "What do you mean?" "The real secret is that night in 1961 in Vegas, when you got cleaned out at the craps table and you needed 20 grand to cover what you owed before Gene found out." Sammy's eyes were closing, but his smile was peaceful. "I covered it for you, told the casino it was my debt. You never knew." Dean's mouth fell open. "Sam, that was 30 years ago, I know, and I never told you because you would have tried to pay me back. And I didn't want your money, Dino. I wanted us to be even. You stood next to me every night on that stage when nobody else would. I covered your tab one time when you needed it. That's what friends do." The machines beeped their steady rhythm. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed past. The world kept turning, indifferent to the small miracle happening in room 412. "Listen, here's what you need to know about the next part." Dean Martin, who'd made a career out of looking bored and unimpressed by everything, who'd perfected the art of the deadpan and the casual shrug, who'd walked away from his own son's funeral as soon as the last prayer was spoken because he couldn't bear to stay another minute. This same Dean Martin leaned down and kissed Sammy Davis Jr.'s forehead with a tenderness that would have shocked everyone who thought they knew him. "I love you, Smokey," Dean said, his voice steady now, clear. "I should have said it 1,000 times over the years, but I'm saying it now. You were the best friend I ever had, the best man I ever knew." Sammy's eyes opened one last time, bright and clear despite everything. "I love you too, Dino. Thanks for coming. Thanks for everything." Dean stood slowly, his knees stiff, his heart feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He picked up the photograph from the bed and held it carefully, like the precious artifact it was. "I'll see you again, partner. Save me a seat at the bar." "Front row," Sammy whispered. "And Dino, when you get there, whenever that is, you better be ready to sing. I've got some new arrangements I want to try." Dean made it to the door before Sammy called out one last time, his voice so faint Dean almost missed it. "Hey, Dino, about that 20 grand from 61. Dean turned back, eyebrows raised. Sammy's smile was pure mischief, pure Sammy, even here at the end. "When you see me next time up there, you're buying the first round. You still owe me interest." Dean laughed through his tears, a real laugh, the first one in 3 years that felt genuine. "Deal, Smokey, but the drinks better be top shelf." "It's heaven, partner. Everything's top shelf." Those were the last words they spoke to each other. Dean walked out of that hospital room at 6:47 p.m. on May 14th, 1990. Sammy Davis Jr. died 43 hours later, surrounded by family. At peace in a way he hadn't been before Dean's visit. The nurses said he smiled in his sleep toward the end, and once he seemed to laugh at something only he could hear, like someone had just told him the punchline to a joke 30 years in the making. Dean Martin attended the funeral, one of the few public appearances he made in his final years. He didn't speak at the service. He stood in the back, wearing dark glasses despite the overcast sky. And when they lowered Sammy's casket into the ground, Dean placed something on top of it before they covered it with earth. It was the photograph from the Copa Room, 5 young men in tuxedos who thought they'd live forever. On the back were 2 messages now, Dean's and Sammy's, a conversation that had taken 30 years to complete. The photograph at the funeral was a copy. Dean kept the original, carried it in his wallet until his own death 5 years later. When they found him on Christmas morning, 1995, alone in his home, that photograph was on the nightstand beside his bed. Someone, maybe Dean himself in his final hours, had added one more line beneath Sammy's message. It read, "Drinks on me, Smokey. See you soon." If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. These stories about friendship and the things we leave unsaid matter, and sharing them keeps these moments alive for people who need to hear them. Years later, when music historians studied the Rat Pack era, they found that dynamic unusual. 5 men from different backgrounds, different personalities, different struggles, who somehow created magic together. But if you ask the people who were there, who saw them on stage or knew them behind the scenes, they'll tell you the magic wasn't about the talent or the fame. It was about the friendship. It was about standing next to someone when the world told you not to. It was about answering questions that took 27 years to come due. It was about paying off gambling debts in secret and laughing at death's door and meaning it when you said I love you, even if you waited until it was almost too late. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has that photograph now, behind glass, in a climate-controlled case. Visitors pause to look at 5 men who represented an era, but if they read the messages on the back, they see something more. They see proof that friendship, real friendship, the kind that survives fame and failure and time itself, is always worth it. Every door slammed, every slight endured, every midnight phone call, every secret kept. All of it worth it. For Sammy, it was worth it because Dean stood next to him. For Dean, it was worth it because Sammy answered the question. And for everyone who's ever wondered if the people they love know how much they matter, maybe this story is the answer. Say it while there's time. Answer the questions that were asked in the rain. Stand next to the people who need you. Laugh at the end if you can. And if you're lucky enough to have a friend like Sammy had Dean, or Dean had Sammy, hold on to that photograph. Write your message on the back. Make sure they know, because someday, when it's your turn to sit in that hospital room or stand at that graveside, you'll want to know that you said what mattered when it counted. That you paid the debt, that you bought the drinks, that you answered yes, it was worth it. Every second of it. Thanks for standing next to me. If you've ever had a friend who changed your life, or if you've ever been that friend to someone else, leave a comment below. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. And if there's a question you've been waiting to answer, or a conversation you've been putting off, maybe this is your sign to stop waiting. The people we love won't be here forever, but the words we leave them can echo for generations. Make sure yours are worth remembering.